Hello. Thank you for joining me on Coming to Know Yourself. I really appreciate you uh, watching my videos, and I work really hard to give you as much information as possible through the whole videos so that nothing is wasted. So if you spend your time seeing the whole video, there is always more deep information, a bigger picture for everything. And in fact, there's even more information near the middle and end than there is in the beginning a lot of times. But I try not to waste any time or waste your time. And in this video, it's the holiday season and we are rapidly approaching Christmas. And I wanted to do a video on really showing what Christmas truly is and what it was meant to be, and not to really destroy Christmas, because there's a lot of good things about Christmas, the way it's celebrated now, and a lot of good people come together and family and joy with kids and loved ones. So I'm not trying to destroy Christmas, but I think it's important to understand what Christmas really is and the mystery of Christmas that we're missing out on, and also what we're celebrating, and whether we truly want to celebrate it the way we are or whether we want to find our own tradition. So I wanted to start off by talking about the history of Christmas and how it came about. And so in the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, Emperor Constantine had a political agenda. He was facing an issue with Rome being divided, and Rome was falling apart, and he needed a way to unite the people. And he had this new growing Christ follower, Nazarene, Gnostic, Essene movement of these select individuals that for hundreds of years since the death of Christ, this is 325 AD, this is 325 years after the death of Christ, and most of his followers had died and tortured and killed, martyred. There wasn't really much left of the true Christ followers. There was just small sects of Gnostics, Nazarenes, just very small followers, but it was still something that was growing, and they had a movement, and it was dividing Rome from the pagan god worshiping that they had used to control the masses with holidays and rituals and selling, trinkets for gods and tributes and all that kind of stuff. And so they needed a way to unite Rome. And so during this Council of Nicaea, that is when they created the false narrative of religion that we know today. Catholicism and Christianity are a false narrative, a false salvation, a false resurrection, and even a false punishment. There is no hell. Hell is a metaphor for the consciousness of the human experience, the human suffering, the struggle, the affliction. The human identity is the hell consciousness. It is the Satan consciousness, or what the Eastern ideology calls the ego. And the heaven is not a place to go. It is a state of consciousness. And that state of consciousness is the experience of life through the image that God made us originally in, known as the truth. And when Jesus says, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," he's referring to that image. And Christ, he personified and became that image that God made us in when he reincarnated here and lived out his life and sacrificed his life to teach us the way to that truth, to be reborn, resurrect that image that God made us in. But Constantine didn't want people free and not worshiping the gods and free thinkers and separate from Rome, and dividing his current people that were pagan worshipers. He wanted Rome united, and so he gathered the bishops, the very hypocrites and Pharisees and vipers, the den of thieves that Jesus scorned. He gathered them together in the Council of Nicaea to form Christianity and Catholicism that we know today. A false narrative of punishment and salvation, of giving up your complete will, by professing that you're giving your entire life to this name of Jesus, and he's the Lord and Master, and you give your life to him for salvation. But the thing is Jesus is not Christ's true name. Jesus is a pagan name called the Son of Isis. And Christmas is actually a pagan holiday of the Saturnalia holiday for Saturn, the god of Saturn, which is the fertility god of agriculture. And it was originally the pagan holiday of the solstice, which began on the 22nd. And all of the holiday festivities that we know of, like the Yule log, the Christmas ham, the decorating of the tree, those are all pagan rituals, including the mistletoe. Those are all pagan rituals, and so they simply just incorporated the coming of Christ as another thing to celebrate during the pagan holiday of the solstice. And so they just lumped it in because during that time there was big festivals, there was partying, there was people getting drunk, and so they just lumped in Christ and the message of Christ that they created into the pagan holidays to bring everything together into one worship, because they would have a hard time getting the pagans to take on this Christianity that they created, this Catholicism, if it didn't incorporate what they were already familiar with. And so we have a few things here with the current Christmas ideology. And the winter solstice and the Saturnalia, worshiping of Saturn and the god of agriculture, is the main reason for Christmas, of the day of Christmas, which is the 25th, because the 25th is, let's see here, the 25th is when the European Aurelian declared that the 25th of December is the birthday of the unconquerable sun. And so that was mainly a festival of the upper class, and it was the Mithraism, where it was a select cult where they basically made Jesus the son of justice, because the epitaph of Jesus was that he was the son of justice. So they're making him that unconquerable sun, the light. And so many things like the Yule tree, that was that was part of the winter solstice, and the Yule ham was considered a sacred. The boar was considered sacred, and it was a pagan god of Freyr, and the Norse mythology, the Vikings, the Saxons, the god of Odin. They decorated the trees with fruits and candles, and the Romans hung metal ornaments on their trees outside their homes during Saturnalia to associate the patron saint for the god of the even and of the evening. And so there's a lot of traditions that are of pagan origin, and none of the Christmas traditions are of the true Christ Mass, and neither is the 25th, the birth of Christ, nor an event that was recorded of the birth of Christ. And so much of that, it's all pagan. And so we can certainly continue to enjoy what we've made of that celebration for family and good tidings and joy. Even Christmas carols were part of the pagan traditions. But again, anything born out of love is, it doesn't matter where it comes from, but it's important to know what the Christ Mass was all about. Mass represents a gathering and a union and a transformation. And so the very story of the birth of Christ is that Christ Mass, the gathering and the transformation. And the birth of Christ is a physical event creating a metaphysical teaching for us. Everything that Jesus did from the moment he was born to the moment he was crucified and died and ascended was a physical, metaphysical teaching a historical event to lock into time and space the very teachings on the outside through metaphors, through the physical, so that not only was his word teaching us the way, the truth, and life, but also his very birth, his life, and his sacrifice was also events, metaphors that we're supposed to see, to learn and transcend and bring the birth of the Christ within us, to learn how to travel that way to that truth, and the truth being that image that God made us in. And Jesus' true message was that he has the way, the narrow path of the way, to travel, to resurrect that image that God made us in, which is now the Christ image, because he personified that very image that God made us in through becoming one with the Father. And that Christ image, that image that God made us in, is the eternal life. It is the truth. And when we experience life through that image that God made us in, that Christ image, we become that consciousness. We experience life through the lens of God, through the lens of Jesus, through the Christ consciousness, which is that heavenly consciousness. It is the heaven, it is the resurrection, and it is the salvation. But the very birth of Christ is a very interesting story. And the birth of Christ isn't just the birth of Christ for his mission and his sacrifice to teach us the way to that truth, but his very birth is a story of our birth and our story of us going through our resurrection, our salvation. And so we're going to go through that Christ birth story and see it in a whole different light, one beyond what is told in the churches as, just a simple reenactment. But Jesus talks about how those who are worthy, he gives his mysteries. And so we're going to look and dive into those mysteries and show that every part of that Christ's story, of that mass during his first time of being on earth, and the mass of the wise men and the shepherds and Jesus and Mary, everybody coming together in that mass, that union together to meet Jesus. It has a very esoteric and hidden mystery of what it really means in the metaphorical sense. And so the first part of that, where he was born of the Virgin Mary. And so whenever you think of the mysteries of Jesus' teachings, you want to think of things being taught metaphorically about things on the inside, the spirit, the soul. The kingdom of heaven is the mind, the spiritual dimension of the soul. And so always look inward to see the mysteries of what the scriptures mean when it's talking about things, because there's two ways to interpret scriptures: literally on the surface, which is the wide path, which can be easily lead to the destruction of the deep hidden meanings with people's vast array of opinions of what they mean on the surface. And then there's the hidden context of what they mean spiritually. And so the Virgin Mary being feminine, the mind is a spiritual dimension, and each one of us has our own mind, our own spiritual dimension, and the mind is referred to as feminine. And so virgin represents an empty virgin mind, not filled with corruption, darkness, with human knowledge, a new mind. And so Mary is the representation of a union. And so the Christ is that image that God made us in. And in order to have that union with that image that we're made in, we must have a virgin mind. Must have a marriage of a union with our minds, with an empty mind, and also with a virgin heart, an empty heart. And so the Christ image represents that perfect heart, that empty heart, the holy grail, the wholeness inside. And the manger that the Christ lay in, when we always talk about the spiritual being laying in a bed, when they talk about you made your bed, you lie in it. Your bed represents your knowledge, your actions, your beliefs, everything that's within the mind, the spiritual being resides in, lays in. And so the Christ lay in a manger with no crib for his head. The head being the mind. The crib that he didn't have was he had no preconceived notions, no past, no future. He was the Christ image is empty of future and past. No knowledge, just complete stillness in the mind and in the heart. And so it's the beginning. This is the beginning of not only the birth of Christ physically, but metaphorically, it's the beginning of our birth. When we're first born here on earth, we are empty of all knowledge. We have our own manger that we lie in, which is, we have no place to lie. Our head, our mind, it's completely empty. There's no place for us to have preconceived knowledge. And so our mind is like a virgin, like Mary. The union with our mind is completely empty. And so we have, the beginning is an empty heart and an empty mind, no knowledge. And so the star represents the place of knowledge that we start at in our spiritual journey, and the star of the east. So the North Star represents the star of heavens, and the South Star represents the star of, the fallen star, the star that represents the knowledge of the darkness of the human light of reasoning and understanding. The North Star represents the divine light, the reasoning and understanding of divine knowledge. And the East Star represents the light of hindsight, reasoning, contemplation, the place where we gather to gain enlightenment. And that's because the East Star represents the moon. And so the sun, the North Star, shines on the moon, the East Star, and gives it its light for contemplation, for hindsight. And so we begin our journey empty of reasoning, of logic, of hindsight, of enlightenment. We begin our journey at that point of contemplation where we are now searching for hindsight, searching for enlightenment. We have fallen from the grace of God. We're now in the South Star, being that human image. And but the East Star is the beginning point, and that's why it's above the Christ when he was first born, because that's the beginning of our cycle of enlightenment. The cross represents the path of enlightenment from the North Star to the South Star to the East Star, where we begin our journey, and the West Star, which, if you turn the cross around, represents the right hand of God, which is the West Star, the hand of righteousness, the light of the divine wisdom that we're here to seek, walking through that valley of the shadow of death. If you take the cross and the upper point, the North Star being the wisdom, the pyramid of wisdom of enlightenment, and the lower portion of the cross being the fallen star, being the valley of the shadow of death, the pyramid upside down of the knowledge of darkness, of ignorance, of the unknown, of seeking enlightenment. And so then we have the three wise men. And so within the mind, the three wise men represent principles of consciousness. And so the three wise men represent desire, awareness, and our will. I want to backtrack and say the East Star, when we begin our journey at the East Star, the moon of seeking reasoning and hindsight and enlightenment, the East Star represents faith. hope. And so when we're traveling through the darkness of our journey, the east star represents our faith in ourselves to travel the darkness, and using the light of the eastern star as our faith, because we're not enlightened to the north star, which is the full enlightenment of all divine knowledge of the heavens. We fell from that grace of heaven, that high state of consciousness. And so the light of the moon, or of reasoning and hindsight, we must have faith as we walk through that light to gain that hindsight, that reasoning, to seek enlightenment. So that is the light of faith. The three wise men are the faculties or the principles, some of the principles of consciousness, which is desire, awareness, and will. So each of those wise men in the Christ story of the gifts are the powers which each of those abilities have. Their gifts, kind of like if a person is born gifted, they have abilities that allow them to be gifted. And so the abilities of desire, awareness, and willpower have their gifts. And so the wise men give the gift, the one wise man gives the gift of desire, and the gift of desire is gold, and gold represents, since it's a gold bar, it's solid gold, to be solid in wisdom. And so the gold represents the wisdom of countenance, of a solid gold heart, of a solid gold character, of a character of righteousness, to shine like the golden sun, like the enlightenment of that image Christ is made of, that is the personification of God's image. He made us in his likeness, of that righteous light. And so that is the gift that is given to us, is the golden countenance of desire. And so we're supposed to learn to harness righteous desire and make that wise man one of us, for us to be a wise man. And then we have the frankincense. Frankincense is the resin of a tree that is the concentration of the tree that represents wisdom, enlightenment. And so trees always represent trees of knowledge. And if you were to gather all the tree of knowledge, of the divine knowledge of truth and love and enlightenment of the light, and squeeze all that knowledge, you could bottle it into a single oil, the anointment, the anointment of Christ, that divine knowledge and enlightenment of the Christ consciousness. And so that's the Christ consciousness is that divine awareness of self. The awareness represents the I am, the self. And so when we are able to gain that wise man, take on that wise man, the gift of the frankincense, the oil of that tree of life, of knowledge, of the divine awareness, the enlightenment, then we are anointed by the Christ consciousness. And then the wise man of our willpower. So the Marith, that's the essence of death, suffering, affliction. And that gift of that wise man is to understand our spiritual journey here, because we're in a spiritual death. When we fall from grace, we're in a spiritual death. The human identity, the human self-image is the suffering, the affliction. And so it's the gift of the willpower to travel through that suffering of the valley of the shadow of death. The gift of willpower, of perseverance, of persevering and having faith in our journey, and continuing with the knowledge within us to listen and trust in our own awareness, have faith in that divine light of the star of the east, which is guiding us through hindsight and reasoning, and to come to know ourselves in that Christ consciousness through contemplation and traveling the narrow path through the valley of shadow of death. And so you can see that all of these things that have happened are metaphysical expressions of our own journey. The Christ is trying to teach us, not only through his sacrifice of teaching the way and the truth and the life, through his very words and his sermons and his truth and his commandments, but it's also through his very physical, historical birth, so that it would not be forgotten. Children learn through metaphors and observations. His whole resurrection, his crucifixion, and his life, and everything that he did through his entire record of his mission are all metaphors. And I have other videos about those, but we are talking about this part of his metaphorical mission. And so we're going to finish this with the other part of the birth story, with going back to King Herod. And King Herod is a metaphor. Now, this is all actual history, but God made all of the history from the moment Jesus was born to the moment he was crucified. He made sure that every single event, every conversation, everything was precisely placed prophetically to create a story that would metaphysically, metaphorically teach us about our journey here of coming to know ourselves as spiritual beings. And so King Herod was a metaphor. His very existence played a role as the metaphor for the ego, the human identity. And so when the three wise men, the spirits of awareness, desire, and will, they appeared, it was basically saying that the spiritual death of the self, the I am, the death of the excuse me, the death of the Christ consciousness, the death of the image that God made us in. When the star of the east appeared, that was the first time that the spiritual being was going to become, it was the warning that the spiritual being was going to awaken. The three wise men were basically telling the ego, the divine awareness, the divine desire, the divine will, the divine faith has appeared in the star of the east. And this is a warning. And the ego was trying to be cunning and say, oh, bring this new birth, bring the awakening of the Christ consciousness, of the image that God made, that awakening, bring that awakening to me. Because the ego planned on putting that birth of that awakening back to sleep and back into spiritual death. But the awareness, desire, and will of the three wise men, the faculties of consciousness, were completely aware of the ego's plan. And so they went another way and did not go into the lower consciousness where the ego was. They went into the higher consciousness. And so the shepherds are the stewards of the mind. The shepherds are all of the stewards of the mind, and those shepherds are the shepherds that shepherd our understanding, our reasoning, our logic, our insight. They shepherd our light of knowing truth, and they shepherd our ability to have power over darkness. And so those are the shepherds of the mind and of the spirit that saw the light of the east, because the spiritual being was awakening. And so the Christ image, the star of the north, is now shining on that place of contemplation. The moon is the representation of the place of contemplation, and it has illuminated into a new awareness, a new desire, and a new will. And so the shepherds of the mind came to see what was going to be awakening from this. And so the angels appeared to them. And so the shepherds of the mind, they said, fear not, because the angels are the light, and the Lord is the righteous heart. So the righteous heart was telling the shepherds, the angels of light, which is the angels of the heart, which is the Lord, were telling the shepherds of the mind to fear not, and that the awakening of the self, the true self, the rebirth of the spirit of the image of God that was made it, that we were made in his likeness, that Christ image is coming, that the Savior of the darkness of the ego will be cleansed, and the Christ consciousness will come and save the whole spiritual dimension of mind, and rebirth the self, walking through its path of darkness, and rebirth it into the Christ knowledge of enlightenment of its true self, back in that truth, traveling the way through the valley of shadow of death, through following Christ's way to the truth, to resurrect that eternal life, which is that image that God made us in, which is now the Christ image, because he personified it through walking the way and teaching that life through that truth physically, and then through his word, his living word, through the Spirit of God, which is the living water and the vine that's come down from heaven of that Christ consciousness, to teach us a living water that will make us never thirst again, and to eat from God's living manna, the bread of life, so that we can always walk that way and be in that Christ image, so that we never fall into that darkness, which is the star of the south, and be in that suffering, that affliction of the ego, which King Herod represents the ego, the one that rules over us like our master. The ego masters over us. And the ego's plan was to kill every image that is ever born in the mind, so that one of those, if it ever becomes the Christ image, that it would be killed. And so the children represent every image, every I am that is born from the mind. Because every day that we are walking through the human identity, we are creating I ams, trying to find that one that is the Christ image, the I am that I am. So when we say, I am tired, I am sick, I am sore, I am eating, I am drinking, I am sleeping, every I am is our children in our spiritual realm. And so the ego thought that if it were to destroy every I am that we create, then it would destroy the Christ image that is born, the I am that I am, the infinite I am, the eternal I am. But he was wrong, because the three wise men, the shepherds of awareness, desire, and will, and the star of the east, which is faith, were going to guard us for our spiritual journey. And they gave us gifts. They gave us the understanding of the countenance of having a solid gold, righteous desire, and to have an awareness that is of the tree of life, the anointment of the Christ, of the very oils from the tree of life, to give us the divine understanding, and to give us the incense of the merith, the incense, to remember the death, the spiritual death, and the suffering, the affliction, so we don't go back to the ego. That incense is a affirmation of wisdom, of our own will, to remember that we're not going to submit our will to the ego and go back into that spiritual death and suffering and affliction, and fall back down to that star of the south, but to continue on our journey following the star of the east, which is faith, and following in the darkness at night, following the light of the North Star that reflects off the moon through contemplation on our journey, to always head towards the North Star, towards the countenance of the golden sun, and to always be solid in our character. That's the solid gold bar, the gift of righteous desire, to always desire the Christ teachings, the Christ commandments, the will of our Father. That's why when God says to abide in love is to abide in God and to abide in the Christ. And if we don't abide in love, we are not abiding in God. And it says in the last days of our journey, Jesus says, those who had call upon the Lord, Lord, in my name, they will not be saved, like the false religions say. It is those who do the will of my Father that will enter the kingdom of heaven, not those who do iniquity. And so he's warning of the false religion that is of today, that is all apostolate salvation. The Apostle Paul, the false apostle, who has been proven to be not one of Jesus' apostles through many scholars, and that most churches reference Apostle Paul and very little of the Christ teachings. And if they did solely reference Christ teachings, it would show that the Christian theology, the Catholicism theology of salvation, is in complete contradiction and hypocrisy of the very teachings of Jesus, and where Jesus is always saying, do my commandments. The law I have not done away with the law. The law, nothing shall be done with the law until all be fulfilled. And what he's talking about of all being fulfilled is our journey to the way, to the truth, to resurrect the life within us, that image that God made us in, to have that Christ image born within us. It's not the fulfillment of him dying on the cross. The law has not been done away with. In fact, he said, I have two more greater commandments to add to it, which is not only love thy God, but love yourself and your neighbor as you love yourself. Guard your brother as the pupil of your eye. He put more commandments on us. And he says, if you love me, do my commandments. And if you do my sayings, I liken you to a wise man. And he also said, if you don't do my sayings and you think that you have plenty of time and you can just do whatever you want, and I will show up when you least expect it. And what he means by least expected is, you do not know the hour and day that your physical body will die, and that you will be faced with looking at your life and whether you had come to know that eternal image of that we are born in, because that's our journey here, is to walk through the darkness, to find ourselves again, to come to know ourselves as spiritual beings. We came here to get that hindsight, to get that wisdom, to raise back into the star of the north, to get that enlightenment, because we are an exact copy of God. We are the light, and the light comprehendeth the dark, comprehend itself, but the darkness does not comprehend itself, nor does it comprehend the light. And so we walk through the darkness so that we can get contrast, hindsight, so we can understand ourselves, because we are the light. And how can you know yourself through the light unless you have contrast? And so we come here to get contrast, to get wisdom, to have that hindsight. If I only knew then what I know now, kind of thing. Because we are an exact copy of God. That's why it says in the Psalm 82:6 that we are children of the Most High, but we shall die like men. We're not actually human beings. We're pretending to be humans temporarily, walking through this valley of shadow of death, through these vessels that our Mother Earth has created for us and nurtures us and allows this body to be our vessel. And we walk through this valley of shadow of death so that we can come back to ourselves and have that hindsight, because we're pretending to be human. And we shall fall like one of the princes. And princes is the principalities in the Bible, meaning the principles of consciousness. Our consciousness will fall from the principles of that high state of heaven, the image that God made us in, and we'll walk through the valley of the shadow of death, which is the North Star, the South Star, while having faith in the star of the East, which is faith, inner faith, faith in ourselves, perseverance, and take those gifts of the wise men of desire, will, and faith, those gifts, and utilize them to walk through the path of the valley of shadow of death. Use that gift of righteous wisdom, our conscience. Let the conscience be our guide. That is the gold, the gift of gold, that solid gold, that solid character, the righteous wisdom is the conscience to be our guide. And our divine awareness, the tree of life in us, to listen to our hearts. The hearts has the tree of life. It has the truth, and God speaks to us there. The Christ image speaks there. And the tree of life is also, our mother speaks there. The Essene gospel of peace was taken out, and it has discourses of Jesus talking about our mother. And God, our Father, is the Spirit, and our mother is Mother Earth. And she teaches us about cleansing our body and making sure that the tree of life, of the fruits of the tree of life also come through through our body, our physical body, because our physical body creates our perception as well as the light within our divine image that God made us in the spirit. That's why it says we must be born of water and of spirit. The water represents love from our Father, and it represents love from our mother through nurturing ourselves through her laws of nature, which is to eat from her table the fruits, the literal fruit, to empower the tree of knowledge through our bodies, and the fruit of our Father, which is our actions through love, the divine fruits of love. And so through both our mother and our father, we're supposed to honor them and do Jesus' commandments and walk through that valley of shadow of death, and always remember the Marinth, the aroma, the affirmation, the aroma of our spiritual death, of our affliction, our suffering, to never go back to that ego. So once a year, we remember the Christ in that Mass of his birth. Remember our gifts. Remember our journey. Remember that this is also our birth, to bring the Christ image into us, and that the three wise men are our gifts to follow that North Star and have faith in ourselves to utilize divine awareness, divine desire, and divine faith, and to remember that darkness, that affliction, that suffering, so that we don't fall back into that spiritual death of the ego, King Herod, and to always follow the path of the way. As Jesus says, to empty our cups, clean the inside of the cup through the path of love, and to bring back that virgin mind, that Virgin Mary, that union, to empty our minds of the ego, of the suffering, to get rid of the human identity, the darkness. Because the human image is the darkness. It is the ego. The whole human identity is not meant to be eternal. The eternal life is the image that God made us in, and it is that Christ image that we're supposed to resurrect through the narrow path of the way that Jesus teaches, through the path of love, in the Gospel of Mary, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the ones that the false religion took out of the canon, which is the Gospel, a scene of peace, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. They are the Gospel of truth. And those are the Gnostic Gospels that were removed and not put in the canon during the Inquisitions to make sure that their false narrative was adhered to, and that we would never know the truth of our true divine heritage and why we're really here to come to know ourselves as spiritual beings. Just like it says in the Gospel of Thomas, if you will come to know yourself, then you will become known, and you will know that you are the sons, meaning the light of God, not the male son, the sons of the living Father, the light of the living Father, that divine consciousness, that image that God made us in. To come to know ourselves in that image that God made us again through the narrow path of the way that Jesus teaches. But if you will not come to know yourself through that narrow path of the way and come to know that truth, to free yourself from that suffering of the human image, then you will dwell in that poverty, which is not knowing the truth of that divine image that God made us in, which is the Christ image. And the poverty is that human image, that ego, that suffering, that affliction, that aroma of the spiritual death, the Marith. And so we are here to come to know ourselves. And there are many Gospels that have been left out, and we will talk more about that. But this is about the true Christ Mass, to always come to that Mass of remembering that the Christ story of the birth is not just about his birth, but it's about our birth. And that birth is a spiritual awakening, to remember that we're not the ego, we're not the human identity. We are the image that God made us in Genesis, and that we are living the Psalm 82:6, where we are the children of the Most High, but we're going to die like men and fall like one of the princes. And that we also we are away from that Christ image, away in our own manger, lying in a crib with no bed, because we have not gained the divine knowledge yet. And we're supposed to empty our minds and empty our hearts. Clean the inside of the cup, empty our hearts, and make thine eye be single, so that our whole bodies can be full of light again, which is make us have a virgin mind again, so that that divine light can enter us through that way to that truth, and we can end our own suffering and come back to ourselves as the Christ image, that image that God made us in, as children of God, and come to know ourselves as sons of the living Father. So in these next few days, this is, I think it's the 15th, I wish you cheer and joy and Merry Christ Mass, to remember that you are a spiritual being and not a human being, and to awaken yourself into knowing yourself as a spiritual being, and let go of the ego and let go of the human image, and look inside you and talk to our Father in heaven, and come back to really connecting with our Mother Earth, and doing what Jesus says about, like in Genesis 1:29, where it says, the fruit shall be your meat, and the herbs shall be our medicine, and everything that creates vegetables and seed is also our food, to come back to that living food so that Mother Earth can reinstill our bodies to also be living in that Christ image, so that our brain can produce that perception that can be sent to our spirit in the spirit realm, so that also our bodies is creating heaven on earth for us to experience heaven, not only in the heart and in the mind, but also in our bodies, because that is the Trinity: body, mind, and soul. So until then, I hope you have a good holiday. I send you my love. Thank you for listening to my videos. I make these because I simply want to lead and resurrect Jesus' message and help people find themselves again in that light, and to come to know that truth, so they're no longer suffering that ego, that spiritual death, and not knowing where to go in life, and finding that meaning of life again. And every video, I will continue to help you find that truth and be reborn in that image that God made us in, and to be free of that human ego, that hell, the true hell of the human identity, that negative polarity, walking through the darkness, and come back to the light, so that thine eye can be single, and our bodies can be like the sons of God again. I send you my peace and my love, and have a good holiday and a new year.